Hello, welcome to EDFGC 5806 and this week we're looking at policies, politics and the media. Learning intentions this week is for you to reflect on the values that underpin policy and public debate, explore some of the interactions between policy, politics and media, and discuss the role of teachers, school leaders and academics. You're going to examine the role of leading voices in shaping public debate and policy and relate the issues raised by these thought leaders to your practice as a pre-service teacher, and also connect the ideas to a case study of your choice. Last week we spoke about neoliberal agendas and the idea that education is so much shaped by, if you like, a managerial and accountability and finance discourse, and that's certainly the case. That's or the argument raised by Blackmore as well, in saying that the fields of education is weakening in respect to its capacity to protect its boundaries. We see that the production and the evaluation of education policy has moved outside the field of education into the fields of politics and journalism, and that's just a little thought to kind of send you off on this week's journey. Also, the other reading that you got this week from Rigsby and Lingard, which might be a bit heavy going, but at the same time is, I think, quite helpful in articulating some of the values that underpin education policy. One of their key arguments is that education values are not discrete at all. They are very much embedded within a broader context of social relations and practices. So for us to understand policy, we actually need to examine the whole context that provides it with meaning and legitimacy. And it's quite interesting when we look at some of the ideas that you're going to look at in the case studies. At times, it might actually focus more on the content and not pay as much attention to the context. So there are different ways of viewing this. Also, Rigsby and Lingard point out that policy making is a fundamentally political process. Public policies in education in particular have to deal with a range of values like equality, excellence, autonomy and efficiency all simultaneously. And in fact, those are some of the key ideas that we're looking at in respect to case studies this week. And also, what's going on at the very moment? Well, if we're looking at equality, excellence, autonomy and efficiency, a quick look at the weekend paper this week and gives you some really good examples. In respect to excellence, in the Fin Review, one of the journalists is asking about why are all the Asian kids on the maths team, exploring kind of the role of tiger mums in communicating and really facilitating and helping students have a growth mindset really in respect to maths and embracing that. And so looking at, if you like, the context of how society, whether we're looking at a family, school level, is helping students really practice and become very, very good at certain disciplines in the schools. That's quite an interesting article. On the Weekend Australian, on the very front page, Natasha Beta, the educational reporter, was talking about 1 in 5 students being diagnosed with a disability, and again, efficiency in that respect to how schools cater for this, in respect to both cost, but also in respect to an equity consideration, how to, make sure that these students reach their potential and so on. At the moment, safe schools is a hot topic, which was initially a Victorian policy, which is influenced by the gay, lesbian and cross-gender lobbyists that have then implemented or pushed for this safe school policy program to be rolled out in high schools to prevent kids who perhaps haven't quite made up their mind about their sexuality, to prevent them from being bullied and increase tolerance. But there's a lot of debate with families having issues really with how this is being rolled out on such a broad scale. And in fact, you've got an example there from the ABC and their Religion and Ethics, an opinion piece written by Laura McNally on looking at the idea of queer theory and how that then is implemented in the wider spectrum, if you like, in respect to public school. You've also got an oldie but a goodie, which is from a year ago, but I think this is still something that a lot of people are talking about, with public versus private education, and does it actually make a difference, and who's better off for it? And that also has funding implications that we're going to look at shortly. Okay, so some key values that are continuously constructed and reconstructed is the idea of equity, for example. Who gets what, when and how? Is this fair? Efficiency, minimum waste, duplication and expenditure of resources might be one of the considerations. Input and output, so the cost of an education system versus how well equipped the students coming out of that system are. In fact, that's one of the things Donald Trump was talking about a week ago in respect to the US, the cost of US schooling and the achievement of US school kids in the PISA, for example, which is the OECD test. Whose judgment is a key thing? Who's deciding this, and what kind of criteria are we applying? Because that's all going to be underpinned by particular values and agendas. Productivity versus prosperity is the human capital agenda that's kind of at play, and some of the things we're looking at this week again fits in with that idea of preparing a nation's children and students for international markets, really, of labour. Security, whether it's physical, economic, social or psychological well-being at stake. You've got some examples, for example, that safe school seems like a pretty clear example, but also possibly equity might be another consideration in respect to that. Community, social mobility and human capital again fits in with it. So a lot of these are kind of interlinked, but they're different values that shape and are being reconstructed depending on what is going on, and also in how they apply to the educational policy and the debates and discourse. They're worth scrutinising. I should point out liberty was another one that was raised in the Ritzvi and Lingard reading, but I'm not necessarily going to dwell on that very much. It was just in there, but anyway, moving on. So apart from the various quotes that are included in the case studies and in the readings for this week, the idea is that we try to examine how politics, policy and media intersect and how it plays out, how they influence one another. Policy pertaining to funding for Australian schools is highly contested, and it continues to be so. And the media debates over education policy are partial, largely undertaken by highly specialist journalists, but they have really significant effects on both public opinion, but also on what actually then eventually gets rolled out into policy and how those priorities are changed and pursued. Increasingly, education systems, schools and individuals have found that managing the media is an aspect of their role that's really important, possibly quite time-consuming. Media is also the means by which educational policy most often becomes known to the public and indeed to professionals within the field itself. And the media does play a really active part in constructing particular readings, both of and for policy, and in interpreting those policies and communicating that interpretation, which is really where the debate comes up, because sometimes we might not think of the consequences, we might just goes in one ear and out the other. Blackmore and Thorpe argue that the discourses of development by the media is informed by the ways in which teachers and principals made sense of their professional identities and the possibilities for action. So we're looking at 3 case studies that essentially, I think, illustrate equity, autonomy and excellence as key concepts, key values, and how they might be addressed within these policies. Before you do that though, and before we go through what those case studies largely include, I would like you to examine the various perspectives and values raised by two, so you pick two of these thought leaders. And so you need to follow the link, the EITSL link there, to the leading voices. And this is actually a collaboration between EITSL and an independent schools association, whose name escapes me at the moment, in trying to pursue excellence, really, and making schools the best they possibly can. So this week's task is for you to, first of all, have a bit of a browse through what all these experts say, these talking heads. What are they on about? So select two once you've had a look around. Sometimes those are video clips, sometimes there's some sort of PDF or an article attached to it, so there's some different things. On this forum this week, write a short explanation to outline which two leaders you've chosen to view and why you picked those. You need to explain what they're on about as well. So what is this thought leader's issue that they're talking about? And they may be quite different. They might not be at all about the same thing. Consider the impact that this thought leader is raising, and how does that then affect your role as a teacher? What can you as a teacher do to help your students become more successful in respect to that particular issue that they're raising? And is there something in the media at the moment that is illustrating what the issue is again? So can you find evidence of this being actually debated at the moment? I want you to select one of the three case studies as well and explain how it relates to the issue raised by this thought leader. So that's the first thing. Now, case studies then. Well, the first case study is looking at funding in Victorian schools. So it's an equity issue, if you like. It's a complex and contentious issue that's regularly commented upon in the media. One aspect of the complexity is that there are different funding models for government and non-government schools. And the second aspect is that there's a complexity in the relationship between the national and state education funding models. Bulk of the funds for state education are distributed through national budgets. And the third aspect is that the issue in respect to this has then also been informed by the Gonski report, or the Gonski review, I should say, of educational funding. So if this is your chosen case study, you will probably examine this further. But for everyone, I'm going to give this brief recap. David Gonski, who, as you probably know, is a leading businessman, he headed the review for funding for schooling in 2011 on behalf of the Australian government. And this was the first major review in 40 years and set out to recommend the redistribution of national education funding on a more equitable basis. And the rationale was to invest in educational outcomes for the future. So again, that idea of human capital and future-proofing Australia, if you like, when Australian students were perceived to be falling behind globally. So that also fits in with an excellence concept. Gonski basically recommended that socioeconomic factors should determine the redistribution of funds so that those with the greatest need receive more funds to address the widening gap between higher and lower SES backgrounds. And the National Education Reform Agreement was then based on this review, and there was, as you probably recall, political debate, quite hotly debated debate, about the perceived threat to the national funding provided by non-government schools, whether students from high SES backgrounds were disproportionately represented, perceived interference by national government in state and territory decisions, and a question of autonomy in that respect, perceived opportunities by government schools to gain more funding for their students, and also cuts to higher education and university sectors associated with this. Following the Gonski report, Gillard negotiated with the education sectors both in the state and territories, to implement a new funding model. And in order to increase funding to the school sector, the government then proposed to cut funding to higher education and universities. And all states and territories needed to commit by mid-2013 to release the funding, and Victoria was quite a late partner to this agreement. It was passed through Parliament in mid-2013, and then the government published a list based on SES data of how much additional funding each school would receive, if any. Essentially, the media kept this issue in the public forum over a period of more than 12 months, and it has flared up lately again with the shift in federal government. Opinion articles provided the context for the public and raised awareness of the role of education in respect to building national social capital, improving outcomes for low SES students, or low SES background students, and also supporting national values of equity and opportunity. And it really became everyone's business in the lead up to the 2013 election, with lots of publishing and kind of grassroots accounts from individual schools, parents and educationalists to personalise and really localise what was essentially a national and state government funding issue. Also, teachers felt obviously quite strongly about this, with having expectations of more equitable and new funding models, which was perceived generally very positively by teachers and school leaders. Industrial unions launched a very strong campaign in Victoria to encourage the state government to sign up to the agreement, and you probably recall the I Give a Gonski campaign, which reached a national peak in the lead up to the federal election. Also, professional associations lobbied the state government to claim and argue that funding was desperately needed. You might recall the hands signed by principals, teachers and parents of government schools placed on the grass as a symbolic gesture in response to the release of the Gonski report. The Age, Kenneth Davidson wrote about the educational apartheid prevalent, apartheid obviously quite a strong word, in the Australia's education system, and he stated that the achievement gap between rich and poor exposed by Gonski is nothing less than a national scandal. A coalition government was elected in 2013 and they altered the funding arrangements under the agreement. However, this whole idea of what is termed a Gonski funding was transferred from the national budget to states and territories it signed up, and the distribution of the funding remains contentious as the media continue to report on Gonski funding. And in fact, just now, you can look March 10, 2016, again, an article about Turnbull's government's new education chief is a strong Gonski backer, and you can read that in the Sydney Morning Herald. So this continues, so watch this space, because it isn't over yet. Despite the proposed cuts to higher education and university funding, the initial debate over the Gonski reforms was focused primarily on schools. The federal coalition government's announcement of a revised model for funding of higher ed and universities with substantial cuts had brought renewed tension to the debate about equity in education, but the degree to which the issue is linked with the impact of the Gonski review is still a bit unclear. The second case study is looking more at autonomy, and rather than just look at Australia, we're looking at an international perspective by looking at England. Academies are publicly funded independent schools, so there is kind of a connect there anyway. And they don't have to follow the national curriculum, and they can set out their own term times. They still have to follow the same rules on admissions, special education needs and exclusions as other state schools. Academies get money direct from the government, not the local council, and they're run by a trust, which employs the staff. Some academies have sponsors, like businesses, universities and other schools, faith groups, voluntary groups, and the sponsors are responsible for improving the performance of the schools. Now, this reform began in the 1990s and it was popular with schools seeking to take greater control of their finances and be free of the bureaucracy linked to administration and direct schools by the local council, district schools, sorry, by the local council. And as a result of the corporate nature of academy schools, with their sponsor partner from industry and the concept of a superhead able to drive up results on exams, the model evolved in a similar way to chain businesses. So it would be run by a corporation increasingly, and then an increasing number of schools were improving their performance. So really it was very much a measurement emphasis in respect to this education, and arguably some financial aspects in there as well. It's not necessarily a bad model, but over time schools and communities became less willing to see the local schools, and it became very much perceived that it was part of a brand. You have a number of websites there that will provide a snapshot of the situation and quite a bit of information available on the internet. Main point of this case study is to highlight the dynamic nature of educational reform, as what seemed highly successful at the start was then emerging some resistance 10 to 15 years later. And in particular, it's probably interesting to note the performance measures at the centre of this case study. And you've got the links there that you can, so you've got both a publication, a report to be downloaded, as well as some BBC news. Excellence is another one. And this is where you have Andreas Schneider, who's one of those talking heads. In fact, that link goes directly back to the EITSL website. And this is a recording with Andreas Schneider, who is the Director for Educational Skills and the Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Secretary General for the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. So he's the PISA dude, if you like, and he's talking about excellence and what we can learn, and what the PISA tests have kind of revealed. So quite an interesting thing to view. And in this case study, in respect to excellence, I would say that this is possibly more of a content lesson from different contexts rather than a contextual understanding of these different countries, because what a lot of educational researchers argue, and the kind of problem that they have a lot of the time with PISA, is that so many countries and educational leaders from various countries are desperately trying to say, okay, well, what are the leaders, the PISA winners, what do they do? What lessons can we draw from there? And it becomes so simplified because it obviously, to make meaning of that, we need to also consider the context of those countries at the top. And a lot of those countries, apart from Finland, a lot of them are Asian countries like Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and as not all of China, but a section of China, Shanghai in particular. So it's simplified quite largely. Now you've got two different kind of takes on this. One is a professor who's active in America, Zhong Shao, who challenges the increasing use of accountability tests and pressures to conform to central measures in American schools. Now you can draw a parallel to large-scale testing in Australia as well, NAPLAN, etc. And he bases his criticisms on the outcome he perceives that in schools in China, there's intensive attention on performance on tests and exams, which means that students have less ability to innovate and create. And you got a report there from the Mitchell Institute, and what should we learn from Asia's school systems. There's also an Australian version, Ben Johnson, who was formerly at the Grattan Institute. He's now set up his own kind of think tank. But there is a report there from the Grattan Institute about learning from the best and kind of taking lessons from high-performing nations in the PISA test and applying it to Australia. But obviously this is a question of culture, whether we're looking at China and America or whether we're looking at South Korea. I'm just going to ignore it. Whether we're looking at any nation in Asia that happens to be doing really well in the PISA tests, and then drawing those lessons to a very different context, whether it's America or whether it's Australia. So it's important to keep this in mind. We cannot access the Chinese debates over the desire to change a deep cultural approach and how to succeed at school, but we can get a glimpse of these through the American response to Professor Zhong Xiao's publication. And in here, the key question really is testing, which we're going to look at more in the next few weeks. So in conclusion, you've got 3 case studies to select, and they're quite informative. By all means, you can look at all of them. You don't have to just limit it to one if you want to. And although it's quite briefly examined in this course, it is possible to see some common threads. Education is highly political, both at the local and the global level. The big picture debates about equity and national futures in global economies are centred on just that. And the media plays a critical role in shaping these debates. And it's dynamic, it changes constantly. So you got some thinking and some reading and writing to do in respect to this week's task, and I'm going to put that up separately again. Thank you.